Okay, welcome and good afternoon or good morning for those joining from the US, and welcome to today's discussion titled Why Do Most Account Fraud Strategies Fail? Thank you so much for joining. I'm Melisande Mouwal, publisher of the papers, and I'm delighted to co-host this webinar with Festa, a global fintech pioneer with over 25 years of expertise in guaranteed fraud protection, and Aite Group. Today we will talk about the rising issue of account fraud. We will address the many phases of this type of fraud, why account fraud is so hard to detect, and how companies should rethink processes and tooling in order to detect and prevent this type of fraud from happening. Before introducing today's speakers, I would like to start with some quick notes regarding housekeeping. The presentation will take approximately 30 minutes and we will have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of our discussion. You can ask questions at any time throughout the presentation by typing your questions in the GoToWebinar Q&A window. During the presentation, we will compile your questions and I will ask them at the end of the discussion. And please don't be shy and do engage with Sri and David. So Sri, David, it's great to see you today. And Sri, could you please introduce yourself briefly?
Thanks, Melisande. Thanks for having me here. I'm Sri Sindhamurthy. I've been here at Vesta for about 10 months now. My background is mainly in product management and mainly in the domains of fraud and AML. And I worked in various sectors, e-commerce, banking institutions, as well as retail. And I've been worked with companies like eBay and PayPal, as well as some of the other fraud solution providers like FeedSci, VPay, as well as Guardian Analytics. I'm happy to be here and share some of my thoughts on account fraud.
And my name is David Matei, and I am with Aite Group. I am a senior analyst, and I have been with the company for about 10 months now also. Prior to joining Aite Group, I spent 16 years in the payment processing world, where I was managed a product management organization. We had responsibility for fraud and disputes, and we did it for both financial institutions and also for merchants. So I was able to see fraud and dispute from both perspectives.
Okay, well, thank you so much, David and Sri. And David, would you please start and take it away?
Sure. So account fraud today actually has many different looks and feels to it. And so if we're going to talk about the problems with account fraud, we need to know exactly what we're talking about. So you can really break it down into two different categories. There's both the new account fraud and account takeover. But in the new account fraud area, there are three different items that we're finding as a problem out there. One being first-party fraud. This is also sometimes called friendly fraud. And in this particular case, it is the consumer who is performing the transaction, who actually owns the card, who owns the account, and they are basically lying to their financial institution saying they did not do the transaction. This is a growing frustration within both financial institutions and merchants, especially on the merchant side when they have they're not able to actually win any chargeback rights associated with it. Third-party fraud is a situation where we've had a lot of stolen credentials out there. And so a fraudster has been able to take somebody's identity, their name, address, city, state, zip, maybe even social security number, and then with it, attach a credit card data or debit card information that's been stolen, and then be able to use it to open up an account and to commit the fraud they want to go off and do there. Synthetic identities is relatively new, and it is growing dramatically over the past few years. With a synthetic identity, the information about the individual, that individual does not exist. It will be a combination of different people's names, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, etc. The person just does not physically exist in the world, but it's kind of cobbled together, and it's kind of hard to identify whether that information is accurate or not. But it looks good enough that either merchants or financial institutions are able to actually open up accounts and let that synthetic identity sit out there. On the account takeover side, we got two variations of that. One being where, with all the breached passwords that exist, we have users, for criminals, who are able to actually identify what combination of username and passwords are good, and then the fraudster is able to log in as that individual. Usually payment credentials are already stored on file, and they can make whatever purchase they want to and have it shipped to wherever they want to go. And so again, that's an unauthorized use of somebody's account in order to be able to make a purchase. And then you don't hear a whole lot about it today, but a growing problem, especially with COVID, the fact that nobody's traveling, so therefore no one's actually checking their airline points or their hotel points or things along those lines, is what we call rewards abuse, where the fraudsters are able to go in to the frequent flyer accounts or frequent stayer accounts and actually take the points that somebody has accrued over their time of traveling and use it and cash it out. And it's a real problem going on within the country. Actually, we have these today. Next slide. So in terms of what are the various attack vectors then that the fraudsters are using to get into these accounts? Well, it really kind of depends whether you're talking about either the new account or account takeover. If you take a look at it from the new account standpoint, the one thing about synthetic identities is that once the account gets created, the fraudster is not necessarily immediately making a purchase in order to go off and commit their crime. What they're doing is what we call grooming. So they're probably doing some small transactions. They're making it look like this is a valid account, and they could be very patient. They may wait months, maybe even years, before they actually do a large-scale attack out there. Human click farms is something that we'll be talking about a little bit later, but we have issues with a lot of the automated attacks that the fraudsters are doing today through either a bot or a script. And there's defenses that, of course, are in place associated with it. Well, what the fraudsters have done is married together both the automated version of attacks as well as the human version of attacks. And you could have people in remote areas of the world who have 100, 200 mobile phones on display in front of them, and they're using automated attacks to do part of the infiltration into an account. And then the other thing that they're doing is when there's a need to present some information back to the mobile app, then they have people there who are just going ahead and filling that out manually to go off and do it. So it's a combination of automated and manual attacks with these human click farms. Really kind of a nasty way in terms of trying to figure out what's going on there. And then on the merchant side, what we find kind of interesting is that they're very concerned about the friction experience. And so some of these merchants are allowing what's called guest logins. You don't need to sign up and create an account. You can basically make your purchase without providing those kind of credentials to identify who you are. And fraudsters are taking advantage of those. On the account takeover side, the situations that we see there in terms of some of the attack vectors really comes down to data breaches. As you can see here in this stat, last year in 2019, there's over 15 billion personal records that were breached. That's just a staggering amount of information that is now in the fraudsters' hands about you and I. And with that information, they're using it to the full extent. In fact, when we go out to the dark web these days and see how much this information is going for, stolen PII data is typically going more than stolen credit card or debit card data. Just amazing the kind of the turnaround that we've seen over the years in terms of the value that the fraudsters place on that stolen breached PII information. Credential stuffing, we all know and heard problems about passwords and how weak they are. We really need to get beyond passwords, but that transition is going to take a long time, unfortunately, I think. We want to be able to move past it. Newer technology is coming out, but when you're able to have so many passwords reused across websites, and with so many people picking the name password as your password, it's a real problem out there in terms of trying to provide security at the merchant or the FI level when there's such lax practices on the part of the users. One-time passwords, they've been around for a long time, but in the internet age, they've been around too long. They're so easy to intercept anymore these days through social engineering and other kinds of malware. And then there's also tools that are more sophisticated that the fraudster has control of. For example, Browser Automation Studio is one of the tools where you can actually marry together a combination of automated attacks and information, and or be able to impersonate a live person behind a session and be able to do it at scale. So a lot of these are the various ways the fraudsters are finding ways to attack the online accounts. Next slide. So the graph at the bottom shows what's going on with e-commerce sales globally, and you'll notice the pandemic-induced spike between 2019 and 2020. So e-commerce sales have just really accelerated this year. There was an article recently in the Wall Street Journal, and they said what the pandemic has done in 3 months in terms of e-commerce adoption would have taken naturally or organically almost 10 years within the industry. So, we are in this accelerated mode of people going online in order to go off and make their purchases. One thing we know about the fraudsters is that they follow the money. And so if consumers are going online, the fraudsters are going online, and based on the chart right here, we're seeing even accelerated attacks going on at the account level. Part of the problems that we're having is that the pandemic has initiated what we call the digital newbie. This is the person who never had a reason to use online banking or mobile banking. This is the person who never had a need in order to go and shop on your favorite.com website. They were very happy walking into the branch of the bank. They were very happy going to the grocery store or wherever the department store may be, but now they had to go online. These digital newbies typically are not very sophisticated, and they tend to have some very weak practices in terms of either firewalls or antivirus protection or malware detection or anything on those lines. And so these people are kind of ripe, unfortunately, to be attacked. The other thing is economic hardship. We've seen people having and going through layoffs, and so they're finding a way. They're trying to figure out, how am I going to put money on the table? And so unfortunately, some of them are turning to illicit activity in order to be able to generate some income, in order to be able to keep the family going. And the other thing that we found around the pandemic is all of the government stimulus money that's been poured into the economy. And the fraudsters have been using a combination of third-party fraud, synthetic identities, et cetera, in order to impersonate people and businesses to either file for unemployment claims or even looking for some of the PPP loans that the government has issued out there underneath either defunct businesses or businesses that never even existed. Next slide. So Aite Group conducted a study just a few months ago, back in September, where we asked almost 50 financial institutions, what are your biggest concerns relative to online account fraud? And over half of them responded that fraudulent applications using synthetic identities was their #1 concern. But not far behind it, almost a third of the response were talking about information or situations where either application fraud or ATO fraud was concerning for them in order to be able to make a financial transaction or payment, whether it be a wire, a fraudulent check deposit, other things on those lines. And so banks are seriously concerned about what's happening at the online account level, and they're looking to see what can be done in order to be able to improve and strengthen their defenses going into 2021. Next slide. If you're going to take some action, now's the time to go off and do it, because this problem is only going to get worse. If you take a look at card not present fraud losses from either credit cards or debit cards, in this year alone, that loss is going to be approximately $7.2 billion. And those losses are going to be paid by either the merchant or the financial institution. And because of the fact that it's card not present, most of those losses are going to skew towards the merchant side. And so these are a large amount of dollars that are being just stolen out of the overall ecosystem. And it translates into higher prices for consumers, less profitability on the part of merchants. And, as I mentioned, this problem's only getting worse. Our estimate is that in just a few years, it's going to be over $8 billion in losses that are now going to be shared across both merchants and FIs. And so you don't want to wait until you think you have a problem or when you take a large loss, because these kind of solutions can sometimes take a while to go off and deploy, especially if you're going off and doing the research, the asking for the funding internally in order to get the financing to be able to go off and do the project, the implementation time, et cetera. So, you're not going to be able to flip a switch necessarily and have this working tomorrow. So really, you want to be able to start evaluating where you are today, what do your defenses look like, and what do you need to shore them up, because the fraudsters are coming. So what kind of tools are out there for being able to fight fraud at the account level? And there's a variety of them. Machine learning always remains one of the top, because what we're finding is that at the account level, you have a lot of data. And if you're trying to manually pour through that information to find the fraud, you're never going to get there. You need that technology in order to be able to look at massive amounts of information and figure out what to go off and do with it. The other thing about this is that you have both device fingerprinting and behavioral biometrics. Those two in combination are showing very promising signs of being able to detect some of this online account fraud. But let's not forget about some of the other better authentication methods that we have out there. For example, physical biometrics and security keys. These are ways that you can do end user authentication and be able to, if you tie the physical biometrics to it, whether it be a fingerprint, a facial, iris scan, something along those lines, you can better understand who it is that you're working with at the other end of this digital transaction where you're not face to face. And security keys are another way to be able to use cryptographic technology in order to ensure that it's the right person going on. And let's never forget consortium data. The more data that we have, the better off we are. And the more that both merchants and financial institutions, the more that we all are willing to actually share that information in order to fight the common fight against the fraudsters, it will make all of us better and stronger.
Great. David, thank you for your first intro on this rising issue of account fraud, and basically you mentioning that now it's time to action. What do you see? What are merchants and financial institutions doing to address account takeovers?
So I would say that the space is really split right now. Financial institutions deployed technology anywhere from 4 to 6 years ago as they started getting into the mobile banking and online banking channels. As those two channels came to market, financial institutions were putting in place, and I would say they're probably more basic kind of solutions right now, and a lot of them are still relying upon a one-time passcode in order to be able to authenticate the user on the other end of the transaction. There's still a lot of them are very much based on just username passwords too, coupled with the OTP for authentication. What I see maybe more activity going on here today is on the merchant side. Going back to the stats that I just quoted about the size of card not present fraud losses in the United States being over 7 billion this year, and the majority of that loss is falling on the shoulders of the merchant to go off and pay for it. Well, what we're seeing is that merchants are more aggressively going through and identifying what they need to do in order to implement some protection at the account level. And so device fingerprinting has been around for a number of years. Behavioral biometrics is relatively newer on the scene the past few years. But the interesting thing about behavioral biometrics is that it looks at truly the behavior of the user, things along the lines of your typing speed, your mouse movements, if you're holding a phone, are you actually, if it's a mobile phone, are you actually holding it or is it laying flat on the table? What is the battery life on the phone? So the merchants are actually getting to more advanced solutions than what we see FIs are doing, although FIs are starting to kind of wake up and smell the coffee, if you will, and are having to actually start looking at some of these solutions. But a lot of the FIs are looking to the merchant world in order to some of the best cases in terms of how to protect the online account.
Interesting. Yeah. And what are some of the emerging threats with account takeover? What have you seen?
Yeah, I would say that the top of that list is probably going to be synthetic identities because it's a real problem out there. We were talking to one of our customers, And the individual who was heading up fraud was relatively new at this particular merchant. And this particular executive decided one of the first things he wanted to do was examine the various online accounts that they had. And as a quick scan, he identified that upwards of 15%, upwards of 15% of the existing accounts on file at that particular merchant were likely to be synthetic identities. And then the question is what do you do with that at that particular point in time? Because it's going to take work to truly dig in and identify whether these are good accounts or bad accounts. And remember what I said before with synthetic identities, the fraudsters are really going to groom those accounts. They're happy to wait months or years before actually trying to do any kind of bust out fraud. And on the financial institution side, what we see with synthetic identities is that somebody will open up a DDA account and they'll do small dollar activity for a few months. And then they'll open up a credit card. And then they'll open up a line of credit. And then they will get maybe a car loan. And then all of a sudden, there's a mass transfer of funds into the DDA account, followed by a wire transfer out to a financial account owned by the fraudster. And that bank just does not know what just hit them. And the loss is going to be staggering in that particular situation. So I would say that we need to be really concerned about synthetic identities. And it kind of goes back to a little bit of the know your customer. So there are tools out there certainly to be able to identify, is this good data or bad data? Does this person even exist within this world? That's one thing. And I would say the other thing that we find is just the human farms. So, CAPTCHA was very popular a few years ago, and it still is. I mean, still common out there. So what the user or the merchant would do is, as you log in, you put in your username and password, and there's some sort of puzzle that you need to solve. Either trying to decipher what these funny looking text characters look like, or you find all the fire hydrants in these 9 pictures, things along those lines. But so what these human farms are doing is actually automating that. So they have the scripts, the bots that are attacking the merchant or the financial institution. And then when either one of those companies presents a challenge that has to be solved by a human, people within these human farms will actually step in and actually solve that particular problem in order to let the automated scripts continue to go up to the next level. And so that hybrid mode of both automated and manual attacks is something that's really kind of nasty out there.
Yeah.
Melissa, totally. What is interesting to see is, or concerning actually, is to see that the persona of a hacker or a fraudster that we have in mind is completely changing in the recent times. There are more and more examples coming up of 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds being able to take over accounts and take over security systems, and also sell those in the dark web to get either for cheap thrills or for getting some money. And social engineering attacks are becoming more and more easier with all the data that is available. Social media accounts or through even something as basic as the US phone book can give you information about your address and people related to you and identities related to you. So just something on those lines. The other concern, as David already pointed out, is that some of these numbers are staggering, where we see 80% of Americans or consumers are using the same passwords over and over again, and that just makes it so much more easier for the fraudsters to just take over accounts.
And I guess to that point, consumers in the end are always the weakest link. I mean, whatever tools if they make it that easy, so that's a good point. David, with COVID-19 in this pandemic, how can businesses continue their growth with online identity verification? So what can companies...
Yeah, the online account is not going anywhere. It's going to continue to grow. There's a recent study in terms of 75% of US consumers have used some form of either online banking, mobile banking, or e-commerce purchases since the pandemic started. But that's interesting, but what's really interesting is the next stat in terms of half of those users plan to continue using those even after the pandemic ends. And so what that's really telling all of us is that online accounts are going to be here. They're here to stay. And there's no going back. The genie's out of the bottle, if you will. And so, and I think this has really caught a lot of companies off base, because if the merchant didn't have a strong online presence beforehand, because of COVID, they've had to really accelerate their investments in those areas in order to be able to create that online presence, in order to be able to continue to do business and drive revenue. And so what I see really happening here is going into 2021, I think there's going to be a massive amount of investment that companies, both merchants and financial institutions, are going to make in terms of anything digital. So whether it be to facilitate and streamline the digital interaction for consumers, whether it be to actually add additional fraud defenses to the online channel, I think that you're going to see a lot of movement in 2021. We were already talking to some of our customers back in the spring, where they had expected that going into 2020, that based on the defenses they've already had in place, that they were going to see a net drop in their fraud losses of around 7 or 8%. And once COVID hit, they actually changed their tune. They were now expecting somewhere around a 10 to 15% increase in their fraud losses. So that's a 20, 25 point change in delta in terms of forecasted losses. And so it's another reason, another driver in terms of why companies are going to be investing heavily next year when it comes to their online channel and digital channels.
Yeah, and it's not really limited to just the banking sector or the retail sector, right? You can see online verification being used even now within the healthcare sector, where patients are, verifying themselves before they go for the online consultations. Universities are deploying that for, letting students verify themselves before they join classes. So online verification is becoming more of a default based on all this situation, as well as, with the trend of online accounts becoming more and more common.
Yeah. So we talked about account fraud. David, what are your thoughts about the connection between account fraud and payments fraud? What is the link between these two?
The two of them are coming more and more integrated all the time. So if you go back a few years, the primary way that fraud was being detected was at the transactional level. There was a request to make a purchase or to do in the financial world, maybe a payment exchange of some sort, a wire, an ACH, whatever the case may be, e-commerce activity, whatever the case may be. So what we're finding was that a lot of the traditional fraud systems were looking at the financial transaction to identify, is this good or bad? With the explosion that we've seen here recently with e-commerce, what we're now finding is that there is data available at the account level when you're signing into the account, even before you start going on shopping online, or even before you put something into your shopping cart. You have information about the user. You have information about their device. Or is it a PC? Is it a tablet? Is it a mobile phone? You have location information. What kind of browser, what the default language is on the device. You have behavioral data that you're able to take a look at in order to understand what's going on with them. Sometimes you've done even document identification, verification of some of these people. But all that information at the account level is gold when it comes to trying to understand at the transaction level whether it should approve or deny this transaction. I have never met a fraud executive who said, I got too much data, don't give me any more. They're always looking for more information. And so what we're finding now is this convergence where the people who are monitoring the transactional level want to be able to bring account level data into that decisioning process and marry together in order to get a better perspective of the end user who's doing this transaction and identifying it. Is it the true good consumer, or is it a fraudster trying to do some impersonation?
And I think historically, if you look at some of the payment systems that we've had so far, there has been some time to investigate and take some action or, revert back the transaction. But with more and more payments going real time and settlements becoming, irrevocable, I think that there's going to be more and more focus on trying to understand the account behaviors even before the payment happens, right? You want to stop the fraud even before the payment is actually submitted. So that is going to become more of a norm.
No, good point.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a really good point, because as you take a look at real-time payments, Right now, it's starting to become popular here in the United States. 54 other countries already support it in some form or another. By the end of this year, we will have 300 banks and financial institutions who will support real-time payments. And we're in the society now where we want everything right away, and that includes our money.
Yeah.
So when you do a real-time payment and that money is gone, you got to be really sure beforehand that this is a good transaction. It's not a fraudster, because once it happens, trying to get it back is almost near impossible.
Yeah.
Great point.
A great point, Sri. David, many institutions are moving towards so-called orchestration hubs, in order to detect and manage all these data points. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and how that works?
Sure, it really kind of plays pretty well in terms of our prior conversation about account data and transactional level data. So when you think about it, the information at the account level, again, you want to feed that into and use it to make a transaction decision. But the issue is that that account data is not going to be part of the authorization message coming in from the merchant. There is not enough room on that auth message in order to include all the account data. And so the account data is going to come to the fraud system separate from the financial transaction. So the question is how do you marry those two pieces of data at two different streams, the transaction stream and the account stream? How do you marry those two sets of information so that you can feed it into the fraud system and make an approve or decline decision? And because of the complexity associated with that, we're starting to see this emergence of what we call orchestration hubs. And what they do is they basically take a lot of that difficulty in integrating those systems and the data in order to be able to seamlessly feed that into the fraud system for that approve or decline decision. So Orchestration Hub really helps anybody, whether it be a merchant or financial institution, from a lot of very complex IT development effort. And it is just like the orchestra, the conductor for the orchestra, being able to bring all that together into one and make it work and flow rather seamlessly. And the other part about orchestration hubs is that it's not just data coming from other third-party vendors, such as an account provider or the transaction provider. It's really, the merchant and financial institution may have their own information stores in-house as well that they want to be able to tap into. So it's kind of the three-ring circus, if you will. So it's the internal company data, it's the account data, it's the transaction data, and marrying that all together in order to be able to make an informed decision. And so orchestration hubs are really taking a lot of that complexity out of the hands of the deployers and simplifying the overall process.
Yeah, you made it pretty clear, David. Thank you so much. Sri, how is Festa protecting their customers from account fraud?
Yeah, great question. I would like to answer that with a couple of slides, going over a couple of slides. So if you look at the typical anatomy of an Ato attack, there is the steps of credential harvesting, the credential validation, and then the final monetization. The harvesting is when the fraudsters get all the information from the dark web, or they have hacked into accounts and got all collected all the information. Credential stuffing or the validation is when they're actually testing out those accounts and trying to see where they can possibly make the attacks. And then monetization is really, trying to get the money or trying to use some of the services and some of the loyalty points, as we have seen. If you really peel the layers and think through it deeply, once the validation is done, the account fraud can be applied at various entry points into the account. So you have the new account sign up or the account activation, where you can use synthetic identities or third-party fraud. When you access the account, you can through account takeovers, you can do some of your fraudulent activities there. Cultivating the account is something that we spoke about, where the fraudster is just waiting to see, monitoring the behaviors on the account and waiting to see when, what kind of, typical activities are happening from the legit user of the account. And then finally, the monetization. Now, in the traditional approaches or in the traditional solutions, what you typically see is that one or more of these entry points are typically guarded by, homegrown systems or manual efforts. They're not really connected. As we talked about, the account information flowing into the transaction detection is very key over here. And you don't see many of those systems in place where you can connect all the dots and make the final decision whether something is fraudulent or not. And rules-based technologies still exist. Excel spreadsheets still exist. Next slide, please. So just talking about orchestration hubs, why it's important. As you see on the left-hand side, there are multiple solutions out there in the market which are handling one particular aspect of the entire problem, or and there are too many friction points created for the end user when you try to introduce various checks. And then merchants are constantly struggling to find the right balance between the fraud checks and to maintain a frictionless experience. So the end-to-end fraud solution, next slide, please. So the end-to-end fraud solution that we really move towards, that we want to move towards, is more of a solution that applies a multi-layered protection strategy. The data that flows in between these different entry points can be coordinated and can be orchestrated. Not only that, when you think about the impacts between these different entry points, like for example, new account sign up and account activation is impacting the growth of the business, but the solution over there, or the possible mitigation strategy over there, is with some of the new verification technologies which look at document verification. They do the facial matching, liveness check. It's really trying to not so much identity proof 100%, but at least get some sort of an identity assurance and affirmation that this is the user that is trying to access or create the account. When you look at the other entry points between account access and account activity, and then finally going into a transaction, you need to have some of the machine learning technologies. You need to be able to see behavior data. You need to be able to do link analysis, connecting the various entities and the behaviors, and then also use some of the authentication methods as a lever to see if you would continue the user in the session or you boot them out. And then finally, the consortium data, as David pointed, is absolutely essential for deep link analysis. And we just don't stop there on the chargeback, on the strategy. When it comes to really protecting the users, merchants from their losses, you need to have the full chargeback, the fraud chargeback protection, which will help them mitigate the losses. So helping them with giving them alerts before a chargeback even happens, or protecting them when a chargeback happens, is essentially the recipe for a full end-to-end fraud solution. And this, to me, is what Vesta is providing in our platform. We orchestrate between these different solutions and try to give that end-to-end protection for our merchants.
Yeah, brilliant, Sri. David, what are the benefits of early detection and continuous monitoring cameras?
Yeah, it's really important to be able to go off and do both of those. I mean, early detection is pretty well understood. I mean, you want to make sure that as a person is either creating the account or logging into account, it's the real consumer with good intent and not the fraudster with bad intent. But it doesn't stop there, because you may look good at the initial login, especially if the credentials have been stolen through a breach. So you want to continue to monitor the activity of that person even after the initial login throughout the entire session. So for example, it's kind of like, somebody knocking on the front door saying, let me in. Okay, you let them in. But while they're walking around the house, you want to be able to continue to monitor what they're doing before they actually leave the house altogether. So it's that continuous monitoring that I think is going to be one of the next generations of where we're looking at solutions and people to go off and deploy. But you think about the benefits associated with both of those, early detection and continuous monitoring. You take fraud losses, of course, go down, which is great. As you're minimizing fraud losses, your operational costs improve. For example, as Sri just mentioned, chargeback management. You have less chargebacks to go off and manage. And so that's a direct labor savings and operational savings for a lot of companies that are out there. The other problem that we hear a lot out there is that The people who are running and managing fraud departments, the fraud executives, sometimes they get the bad rap of being the revenue prevention department because they want to tighten the controls so much that they stop good customers from coming in. And so the marketing people are always frustrated when you have that happening. You know, you spend a lot of dollars to attract the customer, and you don't want to tell them to go away because we think you're a fraud. And so what we're also finding with all these solutions we've been talking about today is that there's a revenue component to it as well. If you take a look at card not present transactions, the approval rate for those are somewhere in the low to mid 80% range. If you take a look at card present transactions done face-to-face, the approval rate for those are in the high 90% range. So we're talking almost like a 16 percentage point spread between approval rates for in-store versus online transactions. And if you, through these tools, can actually become smarter, better at identifying who's the good person and who's the fraudster, then you can close that 16 percentage point gap and you can approve more orders. And I tell you what, you know, the merchants that we talk to, every 1 percentage point of additional revenue that they're able to be able to realize makes a huge benefit to the bottom line. And, you know, with these economic times that we're in right now, everyone is looking for ways of being able to maintain their revenue streams. And, you know, this is a great way without having to go off and do a lot of additional work of just, you know, focusing and training your fraud systems to know good from bad. You know, it's kind of the, it's right underneath a lot of people's noses, but they just got to realize that they have some controls and levers right in front of them and are be able to really affect, you know, those approval rates and increase revenue altogether.
Yeah. I would like to go to the final key takeaways before we go to the Q&A with the audience, because we have a lot of questions. So I would love to address these as well. But could you, David, just briefly walk us through the key takeaways?
Sure, happy to. So, you know, we've talked about just there's so many ways that the digital account can be attacked anymore these days. And so we have to make sure that you're aware of where the attack vectors are coming from. So once you know where they're coming from, then you can kind of take a look at how you can go off and actually protect yourself. So the pandemic especially has created this just tremendous change within the global business, whether it be either at the merchant level or the financial institution level. And that pace of change is going to continue to accelerate. So going back to the comment that I made before in terms of, you know, the pandemic did in 3 months what organically was going to take this world 10 years to do, we're there. And we may not have expected it or forecasted it coming into 2020, but we are in that mode right now. There's a lot of legacy tools that have been deployed. And I would really suggest that everybody on this call really go back and take a look at what tools you've already have in place right now. And they've been around for several years. They're probably outdated. And you need to actually evaluate what you need to do to strengthen your defenses, because the fraudsters are smart. You know, they're getting more clever all the time. They're having more sophisticated tools, and you can't sit back and be complacent, because if you wait till you get hit in order to go off and improve your defenses, it's going to be too late. So the time now is the time is now to act, not when you have that big loss that's going to impact your financials.
And to add to that, what I would say is that if you are looking for an end-to-end fraud solution, my guidance would be to look at these different characteristics. One would be do the fraud solution providers have proven KPIs with their existing customers? Can they support your business outcomes? We talked about the approvals, increase in approvals or revenue assurance. Can they do that? Are they able to provide a broad coverage of the attack vectors and have a more orchestrated approach? More importantly, if they're using machine learning models, and are they able to adapt to the new trends in a very quick way, and also deploy the models very quickly in a matter of hours, because that's important to stop the fraud and adapt to it. Things like the behavior data collection, deep link analysis, machine learning assessment rules, all of these ingredients that are used in your fraud mitigation strategy, can they be orchestrated and work seamlessly together without causing friction to the user? Does the system scale well to the volumes? And has a speed for real-time decisioning, because that's important. And then finally, do they have a stake in your success and growth? Are they going to support your business growth with their decisioning, which means that you have to really focus on not just turning away the bad customers, and also maintain increase in approval rates and also grow the revenue. That's more important.
Great, David and Sri, and thank you so much for your insights into account fraud and the link with payment fraud and how important it is to have basically the holistic approach. I would love to go to the questions from the audience. Please send in more if you like. We will address as much as we are able to do within this webinar, and otherwise we will get back to you later. First question. Is there any solution alternative for biometrics to replace username or passwords?
Yeah, go ahead, Shri.
No, go ahead, David. Sorry.
Yeah, I think biometrics is kind of one of those up and coming technologies. I think people in the past have always been a little bit leery about providing their biometrics for any particular purpose, but I think that Apple really took care of that problem for us, and even on the Android devices as well. We're all now very accustomed to a fingerprint scan rather than typing in a password, either to even access the phone or even access mobile apps on the phone. And then also facial recognition. I think this whole world is obsessed with taking selfies. And so it's pretty easy anymore for anybody these days, especially with the camera technology on the phones, to take a picture of themselves. So I think biometrics are going to be becoming more and more of a part of solutions that we're going to be seeing protecting the digital account. And there's also ways that you can layer biometrics with some other technologies. We mentioned a little bit earlier about security keys. These are cryptographic technology, public-private keys that can be used to uniquely identify an individual. So these are like usually little hardware devices, USB or dongles that you can plug into your computer or your phone, whatever. So you take a look at the ability to deploy those with biometrics, combination together. Is going to be interesting. And I think that technology over the next few years has a way of potentially even in some cases replacing passwords.
Great perspective. You talked about synthetic identities, David, as an emerging threat. Can synthetic identities pass credit card authorization checks, usually done by the issuing banks?
So if we're talking about credit card authorizations from the standpoint of I'm making a purchase online and I'm using a credit card to make that payment, what happens is that a lot of time the card already exists, of course, the account's already out there, and so there's not a lot of checks done related to the identity of the individual at the time of making that approve or decline decision on that transaction. And so unfortunately, synthetic identities really are not even part of the authorization process. But I think what we're looking to do, though, is moving some of the detection upstream. At the financial transaction, it's too late. You really want to be able to catch synthetic identities at the point where the account is being created. So if that's really the stage where you want to keep them out of the house, if you will. Don't even let them into the house in the first place.
Anything to add to this, Sri?
No, I think a lot of these verification technologies that are out there are essentially a lever, a means to combat the synthetic identity, where you can basically see who the person is and verify them with their address or with their government issued IDs, do the facial matching, liveness check, all of that. So.
Yeah. A question regarding orchestration. What about, this is a question about, an idea. What about a service provider for different merchants that already detected the device ID used for fraudulent activity and basically alerts the next merchant if this device is used again? So I guess this is about, also about knowledge sharing and
yeah, I think it's a great idea. It's something that I think if we could have a centralized consortium where everybody could benefit from this kind of bad devices or bad IP addresses and fraudulent email addresses or so. I think a lot of merchants could benefit from that. I actually would love that idea if we could share information. Yeah.
Yeah,
And take a look at a company like Vesta. Vesta actually has some of this capability in-house today, and they also have a rather extensive customer base among merchants and where they're collecting device information. And so, I mean, you can leverage, Vesta consortium data across all of their merchant customers in order to know good devices from bad devices. So while yes, it may be good to be able to bring merchants together or financial institutions together in order to be able to share all that information, I think some of it, first of all, there's some challenges associated with getting everyone to go off and do that, and how do you bring all the data together in one spot to make use of it. But I think the near-term ability to go off and do that really rests in the hands of companies like Vesta and others who actually already are doing some level of that capability today.
Yeah. Another question. So if legacy tools are no longer sufficient, what's coming around the bend? So what's next?
I would say it's going to be the multiple tool deployment. Again, there is no silver bullet when it comes to fighting fraud. There's no one tool that you can deploy that's going to stop all fraud all the time. So what I see is a layered approach. You have to be able to deploy multiple different kinds of tools. And while that may not sound very appealing on the practitioner side of having to go off and do that, I think the challenge for them really would be is identifying what is the smallest subset of tools that are available that you can then provide very broad coverage at both the account level and at the transactional level. And again, I would say that device and behavioral biometrics are two areas that are coming together quite nicely. When paired together, they provide a rather formidable defense for companies out there. But there are also things on the horizon. I think the World Wide Web Consortium, along with the FIDO Alliance, they're doing some interesting things with security tokens and keys. And there's also some passwordless authentication tools that are coming to market. They're still a little bit early, but I can see them maybe gaining traction down the road. But I think for right now, look at layers of approaches. Definitely look at device and behavioral.
Yeah, the issue with replacing one tool at a time is the increasing cost with that, right? Essentially, you replace one tool and then you have to tie that tool with your other tools that are in place. Somehow you have to put all that together and come to a conclusive decision on whether there is some fraud going on or not. Whereas in a plug-and-play platform, you should be able to really look to see how your legacy tools can flow the decisions into, and then continue on with the new tools that you add on to this orchestrated platform, right? That's what, when I showed the Vesta platform, that's exactly what we allow our customers to do. If they've already got some verification technologies in place, they can essentially pass that on to us, but then they continue on with our platform and with all the things that we offer within that platform. So it's a very cost-effective way of thinking about, how exactly you should deploy some of the fraud solutions into your ecosystem.
Okay, we have basically no, we have. I mean, we're almost 5 minutes before the hour, so I would like to thank you, Sri and David, for all your insights into this complex topic, and also into directions to solve this and solutions to tackle this kind of this emerging threat. Thank you very much for your insights, and also thank you very much for the audience for engaging with David and Sri. I would like to wish you all a very good rest of the day. You will receive a link to the webcast tomorrow, and we will address questions that we did not have time to include during this webinar. So for now, thanks a lot, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye. See you next time.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.